Okay, so today we're going to start. Hey, what's up?
Sorry, I have a question as everybody leaves. So from summer camp, gradually, that's to be read for next Tuesday?
Well, that's to be read for this week. So the reading for this week, From Summer Camps to Glass Ceilings by Lavalia, is supposed to be read for this week, but you're not responsible for it by Tuesday. Just read it sometime this week. And then read the readings for next week, by next Tuesday, and so on. Also, I guess I didn't mention as well that we're going to watch a couple films in this class. These films are, have you ever seen Cool Hand Luke? Who here has seen Cool Hand Luke? Okay, cool. So I love this movie. I think it has a lot to say about obedience to authority and conformity. It features the unfortunately late Paul Newman. May he rest in peace. It's a kick-ass movie. I think you'll really like it. And then you'll write an essay about it and how it relates to conformity and obedience material from the class. Then the second movie you'll watch is The Grand Illusion, which is one of those like fancy pants, black and white, French films from the 1930s with subtitles. I know, calm down. I know you're getting very, very excited. Who's seen that? Or is anybody even willing to raise their hand? Okay, good. Okay, a couple people. Good. Okay, I love this movie. I think it's a really great movie. I think it illustrates social identity theory and intergroup conflict really well, and so that's why I assigned it. So I think you'll actually enjoy watching that movie. My experience last year was people really liked it. They didn't think they would, and then they really did. So are there any other organizational issues, or can we get going? Yes, sir. I don't think so. That was my screw up. Sorry about that. So I ordered you can't even order the old edition, but I didn't update the syllabus to say 5th edition. So that's why that happened. I ordered the 5th edition, but didn't change the syllabus. This is one of the many reasons the syllabus is in flux and whatnot. So hopefully there's no difference. That's honest. That's a very honest answer, yeah. So let's get the 5th edition. 5th edition is the one I'd really like you to get. If you get a used copy of the 4th edition, I think that'll be fine, though. I think all the chapters are the same. Other questions? Okay. All right. We'll get going. All right. So the main methodology that people use in social psychology research is experiments, experimental methods. So who here has learned about experimental methods in a social science class before? Okay. Was it like Soc 5 that you learned about it in? Okay. Right on. So we're going to learn a little bit more about experiments and sort of my take on how they work. Okay. So let's start with some simple, just background concepts. A variable. What is a variable? Any characteristic or attribute that varies. I think that's not how you're supposed to define things, but I did it anyway. So for example, gender, income, etc. And there's two kinds of variables, right? Independent variables and dependent variables. What are independent variables? Independent variables are hypothesized to cause some sort of variance in the dependent variable. So for example, we might think, and then there's a dependent variable, also known as an outcome variable. These are hypothesized to, right, okay. The hypothesized effective variation in an independent variable affects a dependent variable. So independent variables, for example, could be gender. Gender, we think, has an effect on income because there's a gender wage gap in this country. That means gender varies, obviously. There are men, there are women, and that has an effect on income in our society due to whatever intervening processes. So this is an example of an independent variable having an effect on a dependent variable. They co-vary. There's a correlation between them. Extraneous variables are variables that are not explicitly included in a hypothesis, but could have some causal impact on a dependent variable. Now, why am I giving you these terms? Because the basic logic of an experiment is to carefully manipulate an independent variable at various levels in order to see what its effect is on a dependent variable while controlling for all extraneous variables, trying to hold them constant. And that's the power of experiments, is that they're uniquely well designed to control for extraneous variables. It's very hard to control for extraneous variables with other methods. Experiments makes it a lot easier. And we'll talk about that some more. Okay, so what's an experiment? An experiment is a research study in which participants are randomly assigned to conditions which are identical except with respect to some variable being manipulated at different levels. So in an experiment, we take a bunch of people and then we randomly throw them into one condition or another, and these conditions are identical except the independent variable is manipulated. All the extraneous variables are controlled. Why do we do this? Because we then want to look at some dependent variable or set of dependent variables and see what effect that difference had. And I'll give you some more. Here's a different way to define experiments. you manipulate the independent variable in order to observe effects on the dependent variable while trying to hold constant all extraneous variables. So these definitions in the abstract can be kind of confusing. So what are some examples? Well, probably the most often used and maybe the easiest to understand example of experimental methods is medical research. And what do they do in medical research when they want to test the effects of some medicine? So say you have some drug that you think will cure cancer or something like that. I wish we had that, but we don't. But say you have this, right? Then what do when you design the test? You give people, you take a group of subjects and you randomly assign them to either get the pill or get what? What's the alternative? The placebo. And the placebo is designed to be identical to the medicine, except inside the pill there's sugar instead of the medicine. And why do they do that? Because they want to control as carefully as possible everything except just what's inside the pill. And medical research, in a way, is really the ideal example of experimental methods because they do this very, very nice job of making sure that every other variable is controlled except just what's in the pill. And when they do them as carefully as possible, the nurse or research assistant that administers the medicine or the placebo doesn't even know what they're administering. So literally, the only difference is just, did you get the medicine or did you get some sugar? And this is a really well-designed, study, right? You can imagine, what if we didn't, another classic feature is the random assignment, right? We take a group of people and randomly they get the placebo or not. Now, a lot of people are like, wait, why do they do this random assignment thing? This doesn't seem to make sense. But the random assignment is to control for all these extraneous variables. What if we assign people based on some other feature, not randomly, instead gender? Let's say we gave all the men the medicine and all the women the placebo or something. Then we go to the end of the study and we say, how did that medicine affect these people's pre-existing cancer or something like that? And we'll be confused because we won't know if the effect was due to the medicine or the fact that the gender was confounded with that manipulation, right? So that's why we randomly assign people to conditions. It's because we want there to be about equal proportions, men and women, in each condition. Okay. Here's another example, some research that I did for my master's thesis. When I was a graduate student and I went to go do a master's thesis, I was trying to think of something that would be interesting to me and somehow be informed by my everyday life. And so I did an experiment on whether or not the status of an author affects the way that his or her text is evaluated. So I don't know if you've had this experience of sitting in like a philosophy class or an English class and being told that this stuff that you're reading is brilliant and you don't understand it. And this was my experience. I was in an intro to philosophy class and we had to read like Heidegger or something this one weekend. And I came into class much like you are here, and we sat around this small class and we were all like, wow, whew, geez, wow. And I was like, man, good Lord, what happened? What was that? And they were like, I know. And they were like, that was great. And I was like, whoa, what are you talking about? That was unintelligible. I didn't understand any of it. And we had all walked in, we'd all read the same text, but they had come away being like, that was some deep shit. That Heidegger guy, I love that guy. He is brilliant. And I had the exact opposite reaction. But I suspected that they didn't understand any more than I did. And you've probably had situations where you suspected the same thing, where you're listening to like really avant-garde jazz or something, and it is noise. It is literally people slamming cymbals against, toilets and you're supposed to get it, but you don't get it, And you look around and everybody else is like, oh, this is good. This is so good. It's so deep, And you think, wait a minute, maybe the emperor's naked, maybe I'm right, and they're bullshitting. So that's what I want to do an experiment on. I want to do an experiment. My suspicion was everybody likes Heidegger, and everybody thinks Heidegger's really deep because they think they're supposed to, and Heidegger's really famous. I don't know if he's famous enough for you to all have heard of him, but he's famous in certain extremely dorky circles. So I went to do this experiment. So what I did was I took an unintelligible academic text, and I got a bunch of undergraduates, such as yourselves, and I was like 23 at the time, so I was recently an undergraduate. They were much like me, and much like these people who tortured me in my intro to philosophy class. And I randomly gave them the text, the same text, either saying that the author was another undergraduate, this very like high-level academic unintelligible text, or a Harvard philosophy professor, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, like maybe the smartest person in the world. and saw if that would affect the way that they evaluated the article. And I controlled for everything else, right? Everybody gets the same text. I'm randomly assigning people to get one, to be told that the author is either the Harvard professor or the undergraduate. Everything else is controlled. Everything else is constant across the conditions. And what I found was, as you would predict probably, the people rated the text as being better and making more sense if it was a Harvard professor that was attached to it as the author. And I said, ha, I knew it all the time. I knew it all along. I knew it. It was all just status. And that's why people thought these unintelligible academic texts that seem deep but actually are devoid of meaning, in my opinion. That's why they rate them so highly. So yes, that man is an intellectual fraud. So some more basic terms for experiments, some of which I'm already using without defining, which is a big no-no. Sorry about that. Manipulation. This is the term for when you turn an independent variable on or off or put it at 2 or more levels. So what's the manipulation in a medical experiment? It's the placebo or the medicine. Does the person get the medicine or the placebo? Is the medicine being turned on or off? And when it's turned off, the people get a placebo instead. What's the independent variable in the text study that I did? It's the status of the author, okay? So the status of the author, he's either a Harvard philosophy professor or he's just a normal person, an undergraduate. Okay, so conditions. When you manipulate an independent variable, what you do is you create experimental conditions. Conditions are different circumstances that are created by the manipulation of the variable. So what are the 2 conditions in the medical experiment example? There's the medicine condition and the placebo condition. And in the text experiment, the manipulation of the independent variable creates 2 conditions. The text is authored by a Harvard professor condition. The text is authored by an undergraduate condition. Does this make sense? Okay. Here's another bit of experimental terminology. Experimental group, control group. Or another way that they often refer to this is treatment group, control group. What do these refer to? These are 2 different kinds of conditions. What's the control condition or the control group in the medical experiment? The placebo. It's sort of a baseline condition. The treatment or experimental condition is the medicine condition because we're interested in the effect of the medicine. We're not interested in the effect of the placebo. The placebo is just there as a baseline to kind of square our analysis, and then we'll look at the effect of the medicine being added to that. What's the control condition in the text study that I was telling you about? Right, it's the undergraduate author condition because that's sort of the baseline. Like, how would you evaluate a text if it was a normal person? Or I argue that you all are normal people. And then what's the treatment condition or experimental group? The high status author condition. So that one, we're interested in the effect of a high status author on the evaluation of a text. So that's the treatment or experimental group. Okay, random assignment. I keep telling you about this random assignment stuff. This helps control for participant level factors that are hard to control for otherwise, even ones that you wouldn't think of. And I made this nifty little diagram to illustrate random assignment. If you're not impressed by this, you might as well drop the class because this is as good as I'm going to get on PowerPoint. This took hours. I hope you like it. Okay, so this is before random assignment. You have a bunch of different participants in a study, and these colors symbolize, some basis of difference, maybe gender or personality type, like extroversion or something. You have a heterogeneous group of people. They vary with respect to a variety of characteristics, not just whether they're orange, yellow, or green, but also maybe their extroversion, whatever. After random assignment, you created 2 groups of people, right? 2 conditions. Like maybe this is the experimental group, and this one's the control group. And why would we randomly assign people? Well, we randomly assign people so that these groups are roughly the same on average. If you do random assignment, there's going to be as many greens here as there, and oranges there as here. That's what random assignment does. What if we assigned on a different basis? Like we said, we'll put all the greens here, we'll put all the yellows there. Well, that would be a problem because then whatever difference we did here, like maybe give people the medicine in this condition and sugar inside the pill in that one, it would be confounded with some other variable, like people's personality type or gender or something like that. I hope this is clear. One nice thing about random assignment is you know about some variables that you want to control for, right? Like in the text thing, I really want to control for year in school, right? In the text experiment I did. Because it could be that freshmen are maybe more intimidated by these high status authors, and then when you're a senior, you got it all worked out, and you're like, you're not buying that bullshit anymore. Maybe that's the case, right? So I really want to be sure that there's an equal mix of freshmen and seniors in this condition, as in this condition. That way, I know that any difference I'll observe in terms of the average rating of the text will be attributable to my manipulation of the independent variable and not to, say, their year in school. I mean, you could do an experiment where you analyze year in school, but that wasn't what I was interested in, so I want to control for it. And one of the most powerful things about random assignment is you don't even have to know all the factors that you'd be worried about. I know some that I'm worried about. I'm worried about age. I'm worried about year in school. I might be worried about gender. I don't know. Gender tends to affect lots of stuff. So I know some things that I really want to control for, but I know that there's also lots of variables that probably affect people's text evaluations or evaluations of high-status authors' texts. I know there's all these other variables that affect that I don't even know what they are because we haven't done that science yet, right? And so random assignment takes care of those as well. So I don't even have to know all the confounding factors because I know random assignment will take care of it for me, at least given a large enough pool of people. Question? Right. So this is another way that you can assign people to conditions of an experiment. You can do a sort of stratified assignment system where you say, wait, I know that orange really matters, or I know gender really matters, and I know I need to equalize that across the groups. So I'm going to structure my assignment to conditions to equalize that. I'm not going to trust random assignment because this variable is so important. And every once in a while in medical experiments, they'll do that. My sister runs like large-scale medical experiments, and she thinks it's crazy that we trust random assignment as much as we do. She's like, what if random assignment, random stuff, can lead to like 80% females here and 20%, females there, and then that's a big problem because you don't know if maybe it's gender that drove something. So if you have a variable you're really worried about, sometimes you'll not just trust the random assignment, you'll rig it so that that's controlled. It's an excellent question. Right. So random assignment can fail, right? Like random weird stuff happens with random assignment. Like here, I've created like perfect random assignment, right? Where random assignment created equal yellows and oranges and greens over here as over there. But in reality, it's not going to work perfectly, especially with just an N of 10, which is 10 participants. So how do you address this? The biggest thing is make sure you have more than 10 participants. If you have, as it goes up and up and up and up, the odds that random assignment's going to get really out of whack go down. Okay? With a group of 10, the odds that maybe these people will be way more extroverted than those people are pretty high, or vice versa, But if we get up to an N of 100, like 100 participants in the study, we're not nearly as worried about it. Okay? So that's the best way to address that. And you'll be reading a lot of studies where the number of people in the study is pretty low, like 75 people or 60 people, and you should be suspicious of that. You should be worried about random assignment. There's other things you can do, like you can use statistical controls. Those of you in Soc 5 probably know a little bit about statistical controls and multiple regression. So there's some kind of stuff you can do on the back end to statistically take out factors, but that's beyond the purview of this class. Other questions about this? Yes? What's that? Oh, in my study, there was like 100 people in 2 conditions. No, not 90 people in 2 conditions. And that's actually a pretty healthy amount. But to be careful, I ran statistical analyses afterwards that were like, wait, if I statistically take out all these other variables, does the result still work? And it did. So I tried to be really careful. Other questions about this? Okay, cool. All right, moving on. Okay, manipulation. So in an experiment, you must manipulate an independent variable, and that creates at least 2 conditions, and then you look at the effect on the dependent variable. One condition experiments are not real experiments. One condition studies are not real experiments. So for example, are you familiar with the Zimbardo prison experiment? Yes, okay, some of you are. They took a bunch of people and, okay, they did randomly assign them to be guards or prisoners, so there's kind of random assignment there. But they put all of them in a prison, and most of the conclusions were like, here's the weird stuff that happens when you put people in a simulated prison environment. But they didn't take another group of people and like not put them in a simulated prison environment. If they wanted to do a careful experiment, a really rigorous experiment, that's what they would have done. So what is the Zimbardo prison experiment? It is more like a demonstration. And other ones are breaching experiments. Are you all familiar with breaching experiments? That's when you go out in the world and purposely break social norms. I'll be requiring you to do this later in the semester. I'm not joking either, I am. And breaching experiments are they're again experiments with the pretentious little things with little rabbit ears. They're like fake experiments because they don't tend to have other conditions where people don't breach social norms. And that's important to rigorously evaluate the effect of breaching a social norm. I think the classic example of one condition demonstrations that aren't experiments is the baking soda volcano. How many of you have made a baking soda volcano? I have. It's very fun. But I also want you to know that you drove my father crazy. Every year at the annual science fair, I would make some like rigorously designed physics experiment that he basically told me to do. And right, you know how this works, right? I had one of those dads, and then every year, like the baking soda volcano would get first place, and my dad would flip his lid. He would go nuts. He would be like at the judges' table, and he'd be like, "That is not a formal experiment. There's no control condition, and who the hell cares if baking soda can make a volcano?" You know? He would go bananas annually, and it was like incredibly embarrassing. And I'd be like hiding behind my physics project, and yeah. Didn't make it any better. So anyway, the baking soda volcano, what do you do with the baking soda volcano? You take some set of ingredients. I don't actually really remember what they are. Vinegar, modeling clay, obviously baking soda. I don't know, whatever. Actually, it's too dangerous to tell you the full list of ingredients. So please, God, don't make a baking soda volcano tonight. But yeah, when you put these together, some sort of explosion happens. What would make it an experiment? Maybe to systematically not include vinegar and then show that you can't make the baking soda volcano. It would still be a pretty ludicrous experiment, though. And you don't need to make all this stuff. That's pure demonstration, non-experimental stuff. That's just for aesthetics and to drive my father crazy. Okay, so what are some important considerations about experiments? Control. Control is extraordinarily important in experiments. It's the whole reason we do experiments. So you want to be asking yourself, as you design an experiment or as you evaluate experiments that you're reading, are all aspects of the setting held constant besides the independent variable that's being manipulated? So again, I keep giving you this example of like, what if the condition with the medicine had a much higher rate of women in it than the condition with the placebo? Then you're worried, right? You get to the end of the study and you say, hey, it looks like the medicine works, but wait, I'm not sure if maybe just women get this disease at a lower rate or they get over it faster. And why are you worried? Because your random assignment failed. You failed to control for important variables like sex/gender. Other concerns, experimental realism. How engaged and into the study is the subject? A significant criticism, with medical studies, we don't worry about this too much, right? We think that the medicine will have an effect on you regardless of whether you believe it is real or are motivated to participate in the study or whatever. But with other experiments, we would be very worried about whether or not you're taking the experiment seriously, you're truly engrossed in it, you're acting naturally, and so on. So my text experiment, it could be that people got in there and they didn't so much act like they would in the real world. They didn't act like they would in their philosophy class. They were just evaluating this text and kind of following the rules and just sort of saying, oh yeah, I'm supposed to say that this person, writes beautiful stuff, And it could be that they just weren't that engaged. And usually this hurts your results rather than driving your results. But this is a concern. You want to be concerned about experimental realism. Mundane realism. How much is the setting like the real world? Here's another criticism of my text experiment, and many, many criticisms can be advanced on this experiment. It could be that evaluating a text in a lab environment is really nothing at all like sitting in a philosophy class. And I think you could easily make that argument. In which case, my argument in the paper that this experiment captures what goes on in philosophy classes and English classes is a screwed up contention. I'm getting it wrong. And in fact, there's this huge distance between those two settings. But one thing about mundane realism is that it's not always good. Sometimes we want our experimental settings to not be like the real world. We want to create artificial circumstances that allow us to study stuff that wouldn't happen normally. The Zimbardo prison experiment is one that has really high mundane realism, though it's not really an experiment. But other ones create artificial situations. So for example, are you familiar with Diva Pager's audit study research? Or raise your hand if you are. Okay, so some people are. Not really, I don't know why I said that. Okay, so Diva Pager, who's a very cool person, by the way, and we'll be studying her research later in the semester, she was interested in whether there's racial discrimination in the labor market in the United States, both the low-wage labor market and like the middle-class labor market. So to study this, she got a bunch of white and black and also Latino and Asian in later experiments people, research assistants, and train them to act exactly the same way and go out and apply for jobs, normal jobs, like manufacturing jobs, working at McDonald's, stuff like that. And they'd fill out the application identically. They'd say the exact same things when asked questions. They were designed to be identical. Totally, not realistic, right? Like, people don't actually act identical to one another. But she created this artificially well-designed experiment in order to see, well, controlling for everything else, does race make a difference on whether you can get a job in America? And what did she find? Race made a huge difference on whether you can get a job in America. Whites got callbacks at much higher rates than African Americans, and Latinos somewhat less so. Again, we'll be covering that research in more detail later in the semester, but point being, she created a situation that was somewhat artificial in order to answer a specific research question, answer it very well. And people have debated for a long time, does racial discrimination persist in America in the labor market? Is it tougher to find a job if you're African American, even if you were identical to an equally qualified white applicant? And the answer seems to be yes. Okay, so some advantages of the experimental method. Control. By carefully controlling for other factors, we can feel confident regarding causality. People debated for decades about whether or not there really was racial discrimination in America. Some people didn't want to say that there was. Some people insisted that there was and thought they had good evidence for it. And then eT7zzAwEbHg came along and gave possibly the tightest, strongest evidence ever that there is systematic discrimination in American labor markets. And how did she do it? She did it by controlling for everything but race, or trying to control for everything but race. Other advantages, artificiality. By creating a setting that doesn't exist in the real world, we can create revealing circumstances that might rarely occur. One problem that, with my text experiment, with doing it, so one problem with my just kind of lay observation that my philosophy classes were filled with bullshit was, maybe they weren't. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe those texts had a lot of meaning in them. And indeed, I would say Heidegger has a little bit of meaning in it, just not as much as I wanted. So what did I do to test this idea that a meaningless, unintelligible text could be evaluated positively if the author was famous enough? I created a text that had no meaning in it, was totally meaningless. It was just gobbledygook. I mean, it was words and sentences, but there was no real academic content in it, or so I argue. And that's artificial, right? That wasn't Heidegger. Heidegger had a little bit of meaning. There was some stuff going on there. I didn't like it, but there was some stuff. But I created a text where there was nothing going on. No real academic contribution, and I still found the effect of status. And that's artificial, but it's a revealing circumstance. Experiments are also nice because they're easily replicated. And this is huge, right? One of the key parts of most versions of the scientific method is that your studies have to be replicated. Why? Because we need to be able to redo them and make sure that your findings were real and can be reproduced. If you just tell us you got some result in an experiment, and I say, okay, what were the conditions of the experiment so I can go redo it, and you go, I'll talk to you some other time, how can I trust that you really got your findings? And a lot of very useful research methods have difficulties being replicated. A lot of participant observation research can be replicated, but it takes somebody committing a year and going to Guam or something in order for it to happen. So they're not easily replicated. Experiments are pretty easily replicated. Question?
Why not just take a passage of Heidegger and the scientific?
Well, because I wanted to make, okay, so the question is, why artificiality? Why not just use Heidegger? And the reason, at least in my case, was I didn't just want to prove that Heidegger was being positively evaluated because he's high status and famous and prestigious. I wanted to make the point that even a meaningless text could be positively praised if the person was high status. So I wanted to make this more extreme version of the point, that even meaningless academic nonsense will be praised and held up as intelligible, clear, and a nice contribution to knowledge if the author is famous enough. So it's because I was trying to make a stronger point than just that Heidegger's full of it. Another thing, I don't know that this is an advantage. Well, no, this is an advantage, is the keep it simple, stupid rule of research. Social science research, I think, is best when it's simple, right? When you can just understand it. And most experiments, I think, when they're really well done, have that kind of basic conceptual simplicity, right? Like, that's part of why I think experimental research, psychological social psych research is often in the media, because in a short write-up, you can understand, oh, okay, under these conditions, this happened. Under these conditions, it didn't. Something about those conditions made the thing happen. Just simple as day, right? So, for example, the medicine. I don't even know why I explained the medicine versus the placebo example, because you all get it, right? You already knew it. It's really simple. Turn the independent variable on, show that something happens. Turn it off, show that it doesn't happen anymore. That conceptual clarity of experiments is a real strength, especially when compared with other methods that are much more complex. Now, that doesn't mean other methods aren't useful, and there's certain things that they can do that experiments can't do, but experiments, this is a huge advantage. It's the simplicity is good. And I'm a very simple man, so this is good. Okay. But the method does have drawbacks, and it doesn't suit all research topics. So, for example, well, we're not reading this in this class, but Buzz Zeldich, yes, his name is Buzz, wrote a book. I don't know why his name is Buzz. He wrote a book, actually an article in a book called "Can You Really Study an Army in a Laboratory?" where he kind of confronted this question of what are the limitations of the experimental method. For stuff like medicine, or in biology, or in physics, there aren't a lot of limitations. Experiments are pretty much the method. They're used almost all the time. For social science, there are lots of limitations. There's a lot of research questions we get interested in that we just can't answer with experiments. So, for example, the ways that specific groups of people in the world understand and interpret their culture, or the moral values that people have in different parts of the world, differences between cultures, these sorts of things. You kind of have to travel to these different places and go talk to these people and find out how they think about the world. And an experiment wouldn't really do much for you. It's not really useful for that kind of research question. So there's a lot of research like that where we don't do experiments for good reason. But in this class, we're going to be talking mostly about propositional claims, claims where people are saying this independent variable affects this dependent variable, and so experiments tend to be pretty useful. Another thing that experiments aren't so good for in social science that we're interested in is more macro-level questions, like the effects of group dynamics on nation-level outcomes, or what the effects are of different kinds of democratic processes on governmental outcomes, different kinds of policies. For those, we don't do experiments usually because we can't get a bunch of groups or armies or governments into a laboratory. It just doesn't make any sense. So as a result, or the independent variables are so far-reaching and so big that it would be unethical to run an experiment, right? So, like, what if you're interested in the effects of having a democratic form of government on the liberties that are granted to the people, and you have this idea that democratic governments grant more liberties to people? Well, it would be profoundly unethical to create a bunch of undemocratic countries to study in the control condition, right? So we would never do that experiment. But it does make answering that question difficult. Okay. Pitfalls and sources of bias in experimental research, part 1. All methods have advantages and disadvantages. I'm already kind of talking about this. So be a methodological pluralist. It's very important that you not think, oh, experiments, that's the only one that makes any sense. That's what Professor Willard told me. I didn't tell you that. I promise you I didn't tell you that. Okay, so be a methodological pluralist. See the advantages and disadvantages of different methods of inquiry. Here are some more problems with experiments. Demand effects. We have significant problems in experiments where people figure out the hypothesis that the experimenter is testing and then try to satisfy that experimenter. That's called a demand effect. So, for example, this could be a criticism of my unintelligible text thing, right? You get this text in a lab environment, and it says that the person is the smartest person on earth, right? You sit there and you're like, wait, I have a feeling they want me to rate this text high, right? It's not that hard to figure that out. So it could be that that's all people were doing, was just trying to satisfy me as an experimenter and be a good study participant. And they say, oh, 19-year-old sophomore author of this text, he probably doesn't want me to rate it very high. Genius grant recipient, he probably wants me to say that person's smart. So that's a significant criticism of my experiment. In my experience, though, demand effects usually hurt you. When people can find out what your hypothesis is, most people want to challenge or throw off your results, in my experience. So there's a good reason to kind of hide your hypothesis, because university undergraduates or typical experimental participants don't want to be predictable, right? They don't want to just do whatever's expected of them, or at least I didn't. And so you get what I call reverse demand effects. There's other problems as well. Are you all familiar with the Hawthorne effect? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Hawthorne effect. Okay, so the Hawthorne effect is this famous bias that occurs in a lot of research. And it came from, and I'm going to mess this up probably, but there was research done at some plant called like the Hawthorne plant, the Hawthorne studies. Nora, okay. So they did a bunch of direct observation research on worker productivity in these plants owned by the Hawthorne Company. I don't know. I don't know why it's called the Hawthorne effect. And what they found was that when they observed these people doing their day-to-day jobs, these workplaces where these people worked would suddenly get more productive. And that's the Hawthorne effect, is that by sheer observation of a phenomenon, sheer observation of people, you can change what's going to happen, what would have happened otherwise. This is a big problem, right? Because we need to observe shit in order to study it. But if we observe it and then change it, then what are we studying? We're studying ourselves watching something, and then the postmodernists sing with glee. So the Hawthorne effect is a big problem. And in experiments, it's a very big problem because we're always observing people. So what we'll do sometimes is do experiments in the field where people don't even know they're in an experiment. And those are very fun. We'll do some of those in this class. Those are, yeah, I like those. Okay. Experimenter effects. Sometimes experimenters can unconsciously give cues to subjects regarding how to act. This has been shown in a variety of studies. One of the critiques of cognitive dissonance research, where people will have their cognitions fall in line, is that it's not that their cognitions are becoming more consistent in the course of an experiment, it's that they feel some sort of subtle pressure from the experimenter to behave consistently. Is that a demand effect or an experimenter effect? Kind of both. Okay. All right. Pitfalls and sources of bias in experimental research, part 2. It's getting exciting. I know. Hang on to your hat. Okay. External validity, also known as generalizability. Experimental results don't have great external validity. Well, experiments vary in how much external validity they have. We'll say that. So the Zimbardo prison experiment, some people are like, that one has great generalizability because they brought all these people in, put them in a prison environment, a simulated prison, and then said, this is like a real prison, and it kind of looked like a real prison. I actually think that one had terrible external validity because the whole time people had to be like, I'm not really in a prison, I'm in a laboratory. Whatever. Okay. So external validity is a big deal. Often one of the concerns with external validity is the sample of the people you use. So a lot of the biggest external validity critique that I always get with my experimental research is this was just done on college undergraduates, and college undergraduates are fundamentally different from the rest of the people in the world. I don't know if you buy that or don't buy that or find that insulting or flattering. I don't really know. But that's what I'm getting all the time, and I'm always having to answer that criticism. And it is a really good question, how well does a lab result generalize to other settings? And it's an open question. And I think it depends on how you construct the setting and also what participants you use. And one way to get around the external validity problem is to just run the study in the real world, if you can, by creating some manipulation or manipulation of an independent variable in the real world, because then people can't say it doesn't generalize to the real world because it is in the real world. So one answer to the external validity critique of laboratory experiments that comes from sociological social psychologists is this is bogus. And they get very angry about it. They're like, experiments are for testing ideas. It doesn't matter where you test them. You can test them in a lab. You can test them out in the field. You can test them out in the so-called real world, what have you. Regardless, you're testing them, and it's real stuff that happened in the real world. Labs are in the real world. You're creating conditions where people behave in the world, and then you're studying what they do. How is that not the real world? It happened. So that's what the social psychologists say. And they also say that even if you were to study it out in the real world, that doesn't necessarily mean that what you observed will generalize to some other setting. The only way to generalize is via theory. And theory are general claims about how stuff happens, and you test them in empirical settings and gain higher or lesser confidence in those theories. So that's the sociological social psychologist answer. I kind of buy that, I kind of don't. But it's important to know because we are in a sociology class. Okay, so who's right? I would say the critics are right and the supporters are right. I think the critics are right that, yes, sometimes laboratory experiments don't look much like the real world. And sometimes that is a real problem. But then other times, it's not a big problem, and the experiments are just as valid of information as data we would get from the real world, only they're better designed. So the truth, as it always is somewhere in between. Okay, that's just, by the way, a picture of a panda. There's no real reason for that. Okay, safeguards against pitfalls, demand characteristics. Safeguards. Have a good cover story. If people don't know what exact experiment they're in, then they can't conform to your expectations and demand effects. So a cover story is very helpful. Also, conduct post-study interviews where you find out if people were trying to satisfy some sort of demand effect. Also useful. Experimenter effects. What can you do there? I don't remember. Okay, safeguards. Oh, yeah, take out the experimenter. Use videotape. Videotape an experimenter giving the instructions. That way they can't unconsciously give cues to the participant because you're always just playing a videotape or giving some kind of on-paper instructions. Limit the experimenter-subject interaction to be as little as possible. Also, you can keep the personnel blind to condition, or now we say unaware to condition in order to be sensitive to blind folks. Keep the researchers blind to condition or unaware of condition, and that's, for example, when we don't tell nurses if the pill has the medicine in it or the placebo. Why? There's no reason they have to know. It could only potentially bias the findings, where they could be nicer maybe to the people who got the medicine and encourage them to get over their illness faster, tainting our study. Ethics. Ethics in experimental research are very important. Pain, for example, is a bad thing. Don't cause your subjects pain. Some experiments historically have done this. There have been a lot of really weird social psychology experiments in the history of social psych. Some of them have gotten incredibly freakishly weird. I was just reading about some experiment where they would have research assistants stare at motorists who were stopped at red lights and just stare at them. Just stare at them. From the street, and then they timed if they would speed away from the red light faster, when it turned green, and they did, obviously. I don't understand why they did this experiment, but it seems potentially unethical if people were going to maybe run the red light. They're so self-conscious about being stared at, or they feel threatened or something, the leering person staring at you. I just had an incident on the BART that was like this, where this guy was staring at me for like 6 stops, just staring me down, just looking at me, and just chewing like his tongue or something. It was really weird. I know, that got really gross. I'm sorry. I don't know why I told you that. It doesn't have anything to do with experimental research either. Deception in experiments. A lot of experiments involve deception, where you're told something is going on in the experiment and it's not really what's going on in the experiment, like cover stories. So examples of that include like the Milgram study, which all of you have already seen, and I'm going to make you watch again. Actually, you can show up for that or not. And then also the replications of the Milgram experiment, which got increasingly freaky and weird. We'll talk about that. Informed consent. This is very important to get people to give informed consent. But how do you get informed consent from research subjects when there's going to be deception in the study? That's not obvious. And people really haven't answered that question satisfactorily, to my mind, because you can't. How can people be informed about the real experiment that you're not telling them about beforehand without screwing up the experiment? Economics, as a discipline, has answered this in a very different way. They have just gotten rid of deception in experiments because not so much for ethical reasons as for like methodological reasons. They don't want people to be suspicious that maybe something else is really going on in their study. They're very worried about that potential source of bias. So in economics, no deception at all. In psychology, shitloads of deception. Debriefing. You have to tell people at the end what was going on in the experiment. This is very, very important. Debriefing is important. That's about all I'm going to say about that. Okay. You're not leaving. There's another component to this lecture right after this. But here's a short writing assignment that's due on Thursday. I'm going to give you this now because I know at the end of class you'll be flying out the doors. This is not the end of class. Please answer that phone. Next Thursday, January 29th, write a short description of a recent conflict you had with someone or any significant, interesting, or memorable conflict you want to talk about, and explain the causes and content of the conflict. It's about 2 pages, double-spaced, and feel free to give your perspective, i.e. go off on the person. I would love to read these. I enjoy this every year, hearing you guys go off on these people who piss you off in your everyday life. And this is part of a larger set of set of assignments that we're going to be doing. Now, again, I think I told you that I had some. I read some research recently. It's hard to maintain attention for this long, so we're going to now take like a 3-minute break, and we'll be back for the next part of the lecture. Okay. You might be able to finish this in that period of time. Hey, hello? Hello. Okay. All right, if I get your attention back, if I get your attention, please. Shh. Okay. All right, we're back. We're back. We're ready. We're thirsty for knowledge. We want to learn. We're rested. We're ready. You all look great. Okay. So now this will be the first substantive lecture from the semester, or for the semester, sorry. So we've kind of established what social psychology is, what the primary method of inquiry in social psychology is, and now we'll be discussing cognitive biases for the next week and a half or so, starting today and then through next week. Okay, so what are cognitive biases? Well, we'll start with a subclass of cognitive biases. Biases are basically ways in which you do not think in a rational, straightforward way, which some people actually still believe that you do. We'll talk about that on Tuesday. We'll set up the whole thing about Descartes and deduction and that view of human rationality as human psychology. Today we're going to talk about a very specific form of cognitive bias called self-serving biases. By the way, I'm really sick, so if I pass out, just ignore me. Just let me, keep taking notes. Don't worry about it. Just somebody come up here and press space bar. Okay. So self-serving biases. Self-serving biases come from something called motivated reasoning. What is motivated reasoning? It is the tendency to come to conclusions that make you feel good. This is probably a familiar tendency to you. You're probably right now going, oh yeah, I see a lot of motivated reasoning. So what are some examples? Well, you see them all over the place. So for example, people have different opinions about how fair societies are based on their own position in them, right? Wealthy, upper-class people tend to think that society is very fair, and that allocations of resources in our society are very fair. Poor working-class people tend to think, no, I don't think it is so fair. Also, there's this tendency for discrimination or prejudice to be invisible to those who benefit from it, right? People say, oh, no, there isn't any kind of racism. Those people tend to be white people that say that. People of minority races who experience racism are less likely to say that. Other examples of motivated reasoning include the tendency of fear of death to lead to increases in afterlife belief. I did some experiments on this when I was a graduate student, and what I did was I brought people into the lab and had them write a short essay about death. Very uplifting experiment. That was fun for them. Or in the control condition, I had them write about just an innocuous subject, like what they watched on TV last week. And what I found was that the people who wrote an essay about death, who had their thoughts about mortality triggered, tended to say that there was a greater probability that there was an afterlife. So this kind of supports this idea that when people are afraid of death, they give more credibility to the idea that death isn't the end, that you're going to live on forever. Also, people tend to be reluctant to admit even plausible flaws in their heroes, political candidates, family members, hometown. I often have discussions with people about political figures, and I'll be like, yeah, he or she does this well, but I don't know about this. And you can tell when they're really devotees, they won't admit to any flaws at all, right? Or your hometown. Unless you're in your hometown talking to other people from your hometown, you'll defend it forever, no matter where you're from, seemingly. Or your country. You might complain about your country here, but you go abroad, and then, and then you defend it. Okay, or the incredible difficulty of ever really winning an argument. Anybody who's in a romantic relationship should know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go into any depth on this one, but we'll just say that the way to win an argument in a romantic relationship is to not have an argument in a romantic relationship, or somehow achieve some sort of mutual understanding. We'll talk about that in the relationships lecture later in the semester. But if you ever notice this, it's really hard to really win an argument. You get more and more angry, they get more and more angry. How many times, think about this, have you really won it? As in, at the end, they were like, you're right. I just changed my opinion to agree with yours. It was because you were so red-faced and screaming at me, that was so compelling to me that I decided to adopt your position. Yeah. And so why do we have these arguments? I don't know. When I was your age, I was in arguments all the time. I was ridiculous. And I don't think I realized that I was not winning ever. Other examples of motivated reasoning include motivated handling of evidence. People tend to attach more significance to facts that cut their way, and they argue that these facts are more important. This becomes very obvious in political domains, where people say, oh, the real evidence supports, my candidate. Motivated group affiliation. Fair weather fans. Don't be one of these, especially here. You need to support the Cal Bears regardless of whether we're doing well or doing badly. And they did a really good study demonstrating the fair weather fan effect. They called people, I think at Arizona State University, the day after the football team had either won or lost, and they asked them, how did the football team do on Saturday? And people would say, well, after wins, they'd say, well, we did really great. We triumphed over the competition. They really sucked, and we're really awesome. If the team had lost, they'd say, they didn't do very well. They're not as good a team as we thought they were at the beginning of the year, and so on. What's the difference? After they win, they say we. After a loss, they say they, right? It's motivated group affiliation. You're affiliating with the group and saying you're in the group when it's winning, and you're saying you're distancing yourself from the group when they're losing. So don't do that. We are Cal Bears all the time. And we'll have more on this later when we get to identification processes. Also, motivated recall. People tend to very conveniently remember the facts that feed into their positions and reflect well on them, more than those which do not. I had a friend in college who used to do this like crazy. He never remembered anything that ever cut against him, and he was wrong all the time. This guy was so wrong, and he'd remember that one thing that supported his position. So people tend to recall facts and evidence that endorse their assumptions more than those that don't. Self-handicapping. Do you remember how I just said that I was going to pass out? That's self-handicapping. What is self-handicapping? It's when you employ some sort of handicap or make light of something that's impairing your behavior or performance in order to explain your substandard behavior or performance. So we all know people who claim to get drunk the night before the SAT. Or do we all know this? I do. My friends are different from your friends, I guess. But I have dozens of friends who are like, oh, yeah, I didn't take it seriously. I was so drunk that night, Also, sick before the big game, or blind spot. What was I talking about there? I don't know what the blind spot thing is. You have a gimpy leg. You have outdated equipment. I used to play tennis with a guy who would complain every time that his tennis racket was outdated and not as good as mine. And I would be like, well, you can get a new tennis racket. It's not like mine's that nice, But people tend to invoke either real or feigned self-handicaps. So sometimes they're real, sometimes they're feigned. Like my friend's tennis racket was fine. We were competing on a level playing field, and I was just better at tennis than he was. That's not fair. Okay. But sometimes they're real. Sometimes people point out self-handicaps that are totally real. Like I faced prejudice and discrimination as I tried to make it in society, and that helps explain some of my struggles. There's also this very interesting tendency for men to do this more than women. They did a very, very revealing and interesting experiment involving the sort of red pill, blue pill scenario. They had men and women take a test, like an intelligence test, and they said, we'll pay you based on your performance on this test. So the better you do, not only will you feel better about your intelligence and all that, we'll also pay you more money. And you can take the red pill or the blue pill. The red pill will make you better at this test. The blue pill will make you worse at this test. So which pill do you think the women took on average? Exactly. They took the pill that would make them better at the test because women make sense. Which pill do you think the men took? The blue pill, the one that made them worse at the test. Why on earth did they do this? I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. But presumably some sort of ego defense, right? If you have the handicap, then if you fail, you're like, well, I had to take that pill that made me worse at it. It's not me, it's the pill. If you do well, you're like, I triumphed over the blue pill. And it makes your victory all the more glorious. Other examples of self-serving biases include the above-average effect. I find this fascinating. I love the above-average effect. And one of my colleagues is the one that came up with it, Dave Dunning. He's really cool. And you're supposed to read an above-average effect article, I believe, next week. The above-average effect is the tendency of people to believe that they are above average in valued domains. You don't want to be above average in crappy domains. You want to be above average in the good ones. And another thing this has been called is the Lake Wobegon effect, or Wobegon, whatever. Does anybody know what that refers to? Wobegon, thank you. Prairie Home Companion, exactly. How many of you listen to the Prairie Home Companion on NPR? Okay, so I used to not like this show, and then I found myself driving around one day in a traffic jam listening to it and being like so into it, and I was like, oh my God, I feel kind of old now. Because, and no offense to those of you who raised your hands, but this movie sucks. This is the movie that was done about the Prairie Home Companion, and it's just unwatchable. But nonetheless, I'm not criticizing it. I'm now totally into this radio show, and it's just it's such a depressing thing. Okay, so what is the Lake Wobegon effect? Well, it is the tendency of people to view themselves as above average in valued domains, and it's a reference to this joke thing from Lake Wobegon when they introduced Lake Wobegon. It's the place where all children are above average. Why is that funny? it maybe isn't that funny, but it's supposed to be funny because everybody can't be above average, right? 100% of people can't be above the median, the midpoint on the scale, okay? Again, I'm really sorry for you people that really like Prairie Home Companion, because I do too. I'm with you. Okay, there's several amusing examples of the above average effect. Most people believe that they are more popular than average. Really. People, like a huge proportion of people think that they're above average in popularity. People also tend to believe that they're more attractive than average, that they're above average in their attractiveness. People really believe they're above average drivers, even though, as far as I can tell, they're almost all below average drivers. And this one's amusing. Most professors believe that they're above average teachers, and we really do, and it's not true. Somehow, magically, 90% of us are below average, including myself, I'm sure. Okay. My favorite example of the above average effect, because it's so striking, you never see results that are this striking, is a College Board survey of 829,000 college seniors who were taking the SAT right beforehand and had to answer an above average effect type question. And they were asked, how good are you at getting along with others, right? And you're thinking to yourself, I'm pretty good at getting along with others, right? Yeah. Well, so did 99.9% of college seniors. Like all but like 15 or something like that out of 829,000 college seniors. That's exaggerating it. But anyway, it's well less than 1% felt that they were below average at getting along with others. And again, this is ironic since most people seem to be bad at getting along with others. 25% rated themselves as top 1 percentile. And that's truly ridiculous, right? Like, you should be very reluctant to rate yourself 99th percentile on anything. You got to think about that. 99th percentile? Really? Are you sure? But, of course, we all are. In fact, I don't know about you, but I used to get test scores back, right, like those standardized test scores, and I'd be like, 75th percentile, obviously that's a bullshit test, you know? Like, 98th percentile, that one's better. That one kind of makes sense, you know? 99th percentile, that's the smartest, most well-designed test I've ever taken. But then again, there's also this below average effect, which is interesting, which was discovered by this guy, Justin Kruger, at Cornell University. Around the time that I was at Cornell, Justin's a really smart dude. He comes up with smart ideas, and he wrote a paper called Lake Woebegone, Be Gone. Did I mispronounce that again? Lake Woebegone? I got it right that time? Okay. So Lake Woebegone, Be Gone, where he was saying that actually in some domains, people tend to underestimate their ability. They tend to say that most people tend to say they're below average, when of course, most people are average, or on average, people are average, or whatever. You know what I'm trying to say, I hope. So, for example, people tend to underestimate their juggling ability. Why? Because juggling's friggin' hard, you know? So most people, when they answer these questions and think about this, they say, how good am I at this? And they say, driving, I am a great driver. I'm above average. When they say, juggling, am I a good, nah, I'm not a very good juggler, so I must be below average. But when everybody says that, you get this very skewed sense where at the population level, most people think that they're below average and stuff. People underestimate their odds of living past 100. Most people think they're below average in their odds. They think live past 100, that's like never going to happen. That seems impossible. But everybody can't be below average in their odds of living past 100. And Justin Kruger explained this with a classic cognitive explanation called anchor and adjustment. And anchor and adjustment's a really cool idea that cognitive psychologists came up with about how we think. And the anchor and adjustment idea is basically this, that when you're thinking about something, you quickly anchor on some initial thought, and then you have further thoughts. You entertain complexities, you think about gray areas, and you sort of gradually adjust to a more accurate sense of things. But the problem with anchor and adjustment is the anchor is sticky. And when you're pulling away, it's like pulling on a rubber band that's set around a nail. And you never get all the way to reality. Instead, you're kind of stuck really close to that first thought you had, that first impression, that first cognition, that anchor. So an example would be, you're asked, are you a good driver? And you say, oh, yeah, I'm a great driver is your first, or no, you're asked, are you an above average driver? And you say, oh yeah, I'm a great driver. Of course. You anchor on that. You anchor basically on 99th percentile. And then you say, oh wait, other people are pretty good drivers too. Oh, Joe's a better driver than me. I got in 3 accidents last year. And you take into account more stuff. And you kind of gradually go, wait, maybe I'm not perfect at this. But you never get to 50th percentile. Or on average, people don't get to 50th percentile. Likewise, you're asked, are you above or below average at juggling? And you say, oh, I'm friggin' awful at juggling, 0 percentile. Oh, wait, everybody's friggin' awful at juggling. Oh, wait, I can actually juggle 2 things for like 5 seconds. Oh, actually, I'm not that bad. But you never get to 50th percentile or an accurate self-read on how good a juggler you are. Does this make sense? So anchored adjustment's a powerful idea because you see it in a lot of domains. You see it with people's social perception, right? People anchor on a first impression of you, and then they never really take into account other information, and that can lead to really bad dating scenarios. Yes? That's not the, yeah, no, okay, so the question is, how do they assess the below average effect is basically it. And the way they do it is they ask you, what percentile are you in juggling skill? And we know that on average, that the average ought to be 50th percentile when we total them all up, but instead it's like 35th percentile or something. So people are, on average, rating themselves too low. It's useful that they know the baseline is 50th percentile. That way they don't have to actually go see how good of jugglers they are. But they have done some research where they did then see how good they really are at the stuff, but I don't remember why. Okay. Okay, another thing that Dave Dunning at Cornell University did that's another clever experiment, very related to self-serving biases, is his unskilled and unaware of it finding. What was that? That was weird. His unskilled and unaware of it finding. And this is, and you're assigned to read this, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this, but the basic idea of unskilled and unaware of it is that people tend to overestimate their ability in valued domains. That's the above average effect. But what he finds, and this relates to your question, what he finds is that that's worse for people who are bad in those domains. So the people that most exaggerate their ability in some domain, like doing good at math or working, well, math's a bad example, but doing work in some workplace environment, the people who most overestimate their abilities are the people who are worst at that job or whatever. Now, if you're anything like me, you're immediately thinking of some coworker you had or something who was certain that they were outstanding at the job that you were both doing and was actually terrible at this job, right? And the trick about this tendency is that people are unaware of it, right? Like they then become, their incompetence is invisible to them. The people with least competence in some domain most overestimate their abilities and therefore can't see that they're unskilled and just get out of your way so that you can do whatever the job is, right? I used to work in kitchens. I was a cook for like a year, and I worked with many people who were unskilled and unaware of it. But then the trick is, how do I know I wasn't unskilled and unaware of it? I wouldn't know. So perhaps I was the asshole. Okay. It's important to always ask that question. Okay, another one, the holier-than-thou effect. This is basically the above-average effect in moral domains. So it's just a subset of the above-average effect, which is itself a subset of all self-serving biases. So people tend to believe that they're basically more moral than average and less immoral than average. So they think they're less likely to obey obedience commands in the Milgram experiment, which you've all seen, so I don't have to explain what that means. They believe that they're more likely to cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma, which is a situation where you can cooperate or defect on a partner. Defection is essentially immoral. They believe that they're more likely to give up their seat to a pregnant woman. These are all percentile things. So when they're asked, what percentile are you in terms of your probability of giving up your seat to a pregnant woman on the BART or something like that, people will say, oh, I'm like 80th percentile, 90th percentile. But of course, everybody can't be 80th, 90th percentile. And Epley and Dunning show that this is driven by misperceiving the self, not others. Basically, people tend to see themselves as more moral than they really are. They kind of got everybody else right. They kind of know, yeah, everybody else is a mix of morality, but I am morally perfect. And that skews people's self-ratings relative to others. And so when you predict for yourself, you underweight. Wait, what? Hold on. Oh, right. This could be repaired if you gave enough weight to how moral everybody else is. Your estimates could be better, but you tend to not weight your assessments of others, or you focus too much on your own excessively flattering assessments of your own morality and not enough on this very accurate data that you have about everybody else's morality. Sorry, they got a little confusing. Okay, so some quotes that I'll leave you with at the end of today's lecture about self-serving biases. Pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. That's often called pride goeth before the fall. It's a quote from the Bible. From Borges, the image of the Lord has been replaced by a mirror. And the great social psychologist Ice Cube said, check yourself before you wreck yourself. And he meant it. And it is true. I think you'll see across the course of this semester that Ice Cube is one of the most brilliant social psychologists of all time.